Today, we'll be discussing about which core services to keep in the humanitarian system going forward. It's a very particular moment for all of us, as you're all acutely aware. So maybe to set the scenes, a couple of words on where we are right now. So we're all part of a humanitarian system which was conceived and developed at a time in which there was a broader international effort to promote common good for humanity, at least in narrative. And in a way, what we did, the humanitarian system as we know it, was one of the most noble expressions of this international system, a sort of joint commitment by what we call the so-called international community to come together to support the most vulnerable when they're affected by crisis. And underpinning this collective objective of international solidarity was a kind of shared belief, no, it's not kind of, actually a very important shared belief in multilateralism and institutional multilateralism, the UN, the cluster system, and so on, as a vehicle that would enable us to achieve these objectives over time. So based on this and leveraging on it, since the latest reiteration of the humanitarian system that we know now, so 2005, the humanitarian architecture has led to significant headway towards these shared objectives of common humanity. And for all the shortcomings that we've been discussing over the years, the humanitarian architecture has enabled a variety of individuals, actors, including all of us here in this room, to come together to contribute towards this common goal. The relative success of the humanitarian architecture led to gradual, although very slow, but still gradual improvements that were tangible, gradual improvements in the way that we responded, and increased in funding, which peaked a couple of years ago. So as we know, this positive momentum, or this momentum, started reversing a couple of years ago with the general decline of the humanitarian funding, which were in line with the general decline of narratives around common good, narratives that we saw in the political space in many countries, but also in international relations. And the recent US announcements in January, February accelerated and accelerated this reversal very quickly, suddenly bringing home to all of us this new reality of the humanitarian system. Less funding, more donor pressure and involvement, less belief in multilateralism. It's not a new reality that we asked for, and I don't think any of us wanted this new reality, but it's there, and we have no choice but to face it and face its impact and prepare ourselves for the inevitable transformational effect that it will have on humanitarian action and coordination. And as we reflect on this and we enter this new phase of humanitarianism, I think we need to reflect on how we can do our best to preserve some of the key common objectives that led us to create the humanitarian architecture and build on the good progress that here and there, but quite across the board actually, had been made. Let's not forget about all this progress. So today's panel will focus on this. Will enable an exchange in which we'll discuss about which core services should be maintained in the future of humanitarian response. So to kickstart the discussion, we have two reflections from Katie. First of all, from my colleague at Impact, she's the Director of Global Programs, and from Jeremy from ICFA, who's the Head of Humanitarian Coordination. So Katie will speak to us about the critical importance of determining where need is most severe in order to enable a need-based prioritization, while Jeremy will discuss how it's more important than ever to deliver aid through local actors to make it more impactful, relevant, and fair. So following this reflection, I'll ask our distinguished panelists to have a first round of reactions. But before I do so, let me introduce them, maybe in the sitting order. So I have next to me Myrène Bengoa. You have 25 years of experience in humanitarian affairs, public health, and philanthropic governance. You have led Swiss Solidarity and Group SOS international divisions, advising UN agencies in fragile settings. You also launched and managed the Fondation Chanel, and you served and continue to serve on multiple governance boards in the philanthropic sector. Thank you for being with us, Myrène. Then Manuel, who many of you know, and who has a long, rich, and field-tested humanitarian experience. So you recently retired, but remain very active. Before you retire, you were Swiss ambassador, and you were head of Swiss Humanitarian Aid, SDC. And during your long career in humanitarian service with ICRC, OCHA, and SDC, you worked both at the field level and in headquarters. And today, you're an ambassador of the Grand Bargain Initiatives for Localization and a member of the Council of the Swiss Red Cross and the ex officio vice president of the IFRC. You're a lawyer and you studied at the University of Zurich and the Harvard Law School. Thank you for being with us, Manuel. So then we have Tamam here with us. Tamam Aloudat, a Syrian-Swiss physician with over 2 decades of experience at the forefront of international humanitarian organizations. You're a leading advocate for decolonizing global health and advancing humanitarianism. And you started your humanitarian career as volunteer for the Syrian Red Crescent and then IFRC in Iraq in 2003. And over the last 20 years, you worked in emergencies ranging from conflicts and forced displacement to disaster and disease outbreak, from Darfur to the Indian Ocean tsunami to Haiti earthquake. Your most recent role was as president of MSF Netherlands and as a member of MSF's international board. Thank you for being with us, Tamam. And last but not least, we have Marisa Leon Gomez-Sonet. And sorry, Tamam, I didn't mention the main thing. You're the CEO of the New Humanitarian, of course. I had the bio there, but I forgot to introduce you to your current title. Myrène, did I introduce you to your...
Yes, you did.
I did. You're the CEO. Then you're gonna here. Yes. Very good. And then last but not least, we have Marisa Leon Gomez-Sonet. So Marisa is the partnership and stakeholder advisor for refugees seeking equal access at the table, our seat, working to advance meaningful refugee participation as a tool to enhance global refugee policy. She has worked on migration, refugee, and human rights policy at the multilateral, national, regional, and city levels. At the national level in the US, you advocated Congress to expand regularization pathways, oppose discrimination, travel bans, and increase refugee resettlements. And at the Quaker United Nations office in Geneva, you've engaged with states, civil society, and the UN, supporting migrant participation in key multilateral progress like the Global Compact on Migration. At the city level in Chicago, you've helped strengthen migration and sanctuary policies led by affected communities. You're originally from Tegucigalpa, Honduras, and you hold a Master in Global Affairs from the University of Notre Dame and the Bachelor of Global Studies from Salve Regina University. Thank you for being with us today, Marisa. So, introductions done, and with no further delay, I hand over to yourself, Katie, to provide the first reflections.
Thanks, Luca. So maybe let's start off with some good news, which feels like it's in pretty short supply at the moment. Since 2003, when ODI released their seminal paper, According to Need, which is a slightly esoteric reference for maybe those of the more nerdy persuasion in the audience, the humanitarian data and analysis system has come a long, long way. At that time in 2003, they were talking about the lack of any type of joined up needs assessments, the lack of any type of joined up needs analysis. There was not, regular data collection to understand malnutrition, mortality, food security. They didn't have things like the IPC. And we're now 23 years later, and things are starting to look a lot different. And that's been in part thanks to the Grand Bargain. I think 2016 was this really critical moment that drove a huge amount of change as a result of this landmark commitment that by donors and humanitarian actors to try and improve how needs are assessed and prioritized. And in the decades since then, I think we've made huge strides as a system from a really fragmented and anecdotal needs analysis and assessment approach towards much more systematic and robust approaches to trying to understand need and trying to make sure we inform our prioritization choices according to need. And just to put that into some kind of practical terms, as of 2016, there were very few MSNAs. Since 2016, as Reach, we've run over 100 MSNAs in 30 countries since 2016. And as of 2024, us as a collective humanitarian system now have joint intersectoral analysis, the GIAF, running in all HPC countries, which represents a huge collective achievement for us as a system. But while we've made some really positive progress, and I think we shouldn't underestimate that, core challenges remain. We have a very, very unequal data landscape, and we're not yet at the point where all crises have access to the same information to understand need and make sure that we can actually respond to those needs. And what we're seeing still is that data scarcity tends to reinforce funding scarcity, with data poor contexts having less well understood needs and less global attention and resources. We're also not yet able to produce a collective understanding of need that is consistent and comparable across crises. This isn't the case for every sector. So of course we have the IPC, which does provide that comparable analysis of need and has been really instrumental in improving the prioritization of food security responses. But at the multi-sectoral level, outside of the IPC, we now have the GIAF, but it's not yet designed to produce a consistent and comparable analysis of need across crises. And that basically means in practice, we don't yet have the necessary information to ensure we have the knowledge to take impartial and fair allocation choices and make sure that we're prioritizing scarce resources to those most in need. And last but not least, a core challenge that remains is we've yet to meaningfully bring in populations' own preferences and priorities into these analysis systems. The data now does exist. We as Reach have collected an enormous amount, GTS, many other organizations have as well, yet we are still not systematically incorporating populations' own priorities into the way that we measure and understand need in processes like the HNO. So those are the kind of core challenges that were the core challenges up until January 2025. And then, of course, we've had this huge new shock to the system and this large reduction of US funding, along with kind of co-occurring cuts from other donors, is really already starting to exacerbate these structural weaknesses. Particularly for us, I think we're seeing the suspension of US funding being the major cause of this, as they were previously a leading contributor on needs assessments and analysis. And the loss of that funding has accelerated some of the issues that I mentioned earlier. Just to put it into perspective, of the 17 multi-sector needs assessments that we had planned to inform the humanitarian needs overview and the humanitarian response plan this year, 14 right now are at risk of suspension, which would leave $10 billion, assuming the same funding amounts as last year, in humanitarian funding, potentially without a rigorous evidence base. Countries like South Sudan, DRC, and Gaza, which rely heavily on US funding, now face deteriorating data pipelines. We don't have the capacity to collect the necessary data to understand what's happening at the crisis level, just as needs are starting to rise most sharply. And without these data pipelines coming back online, we really threaten the kind of fundamentals of the system that enable needs-based prioritization, and we risk reinforcing politically driven decision-making at the expense of those most in need. So, in that quite stark backdrop, what can we do about it? I think for us, what we think is to uphold the integrity of our humanitarian planning systems and to ensure that aid reaches those in greatest need. We have to accelerate reforms and safeguard the credibility of needs-based systems through the following. The first priority is to protect our core data production systems, our data collection systems. Without good quality data, and I know it sounds really basic, but it is impossible to understand what is actually happening and run good quality analysis. And we risk running blind at the very moment when we expect needs to accelerate sharply. And again, to kind of put this into perspective, a lot of our global analysis systems, the IPC, the HNO, Inform, all rely on actually quite a few core data production systems, such as the MSNA, food security and nutrition surveys, smart surveys, and displacement tracking. And if those data kind of pipelines stop, our analysis processes will no longer work or will not produce good quality analysis. We have a phrase inside the organization, garbage in, garbage out, and that is the real risk we're going to have towards the end of the year if these data pipelines don't come back online. The second big priority is strengthening our needs analysis. We still have some kind of current challenges that I think it won't take an enormous amount of resource investment to improve. We are yet to produce cross-crisis comparable analysis of need outside of the food security and nutrition sectors. We've got now the method, the GF does exist. I think it's more a matter of applying it consistently in all crises rather than investing in a huge amount of new resources to do this differently. The second piece that we would think would be really important to make sure that we have the necessary analysis to inform needs-based prioritization is ensuring that our analysis processes are really equipped to identify who is most acutely in need. Again, we've got the GF severity analysis module now, so we've got some methods. It's again about applying them consistently and trying to make sure that we really take the time and energy to understand who is most at risk of losing their life in the coming months and years ahead. And then finally, we have a responsibility to bring in populations' own understanding of their priorities into the way we measure need. We've got the data. It's not a hugely complicated task to bring that data into the way that we analyse need as part of the GF and the HNO. And without this, we risk misprioritizing resources to issues that will not resolve the fundamental problems that are driving needs for populations. So in conclusion, I think we see the suspension of US funding as a wake-up call. We can't afford to lose the gains we made under the Grand Bargain. And in this moment of financial strain and rising global need, we've got to double down on our commitment to principled, data-driven prioritization. And this requires a collective and political resolve to maintain and improve the systems that we have to enable us to see and to serve those most at risk.
Thank you, Katie. Now over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Luca. Good afternoon, all. Colleagues, when we've been discussing recently with our members and partners the current crisis the system faces, we're really seeing, I guess, two perspectives. One seems to be what I would call conflicted optimism. Perhaps this is the catalytic moment we've all been waiting for to drive the change that has many of our organizations have been asking for, the so-called humanitarian reset, as the ERC frames it. The other perspective, I would say, is more of a resigned reality that despite the years and decades of discussion around reform, we have not yet achieved sufficient necessary action. And we're learning now in real time just how far we have to go. And I think despite the attempts at some level of optimism, clearly the international humanitarian system was not ready to safeguard local action and accountability to affected populations when it was needed most. And we have a very interesting report that ICFA released recently, which I'd encourage you to read, which articulates a lot of what we found from talking to our NGO members around this globally. So in response to the funding pressure, we see the humanitarian ambition at a systemic level is rapidly shrinking, and it could be argued this is right sizing, and perhaps this is something we can discuss further. But we're left with the key question of who is defining the parameters around this. And as we've heard, prioritization within responses and between countries is increasingly the focus. We're trying to learn as a system to scale down, which seems to be much harder than scaling up. And we must continue to challenge those taking decisions to do this in dialogue with communities and involving the local, national and international actors that are necessary to ensure that as best possible we can maintain a protection-centred and needs-based response. And now more than ever, we feel we must advocate and champion NGO leadership, the recognition of good partnering practices and local and national NGO roles and priorities beyond funding, particularly meaningful participation in shaping responses, influencing policy and decision-making at all levels. So to be a little bit positive, perhaps, despite the challenges, the reduced ambition of the system might lead to three opportunities, each with its implications for locally led action. The first of these would be refocusing on our mission to reach those most in need. And that means, of course, the tools and capacities, as Katie has highlighted, are necessary, but also the capacities, relationships and risk-sharing approaches for actors to enable humanitarian access. We see in many cases the international system is increasingly being blocked, unable or unwilling to assume the levels of risk needed. I'm speaking too quickly. I will slow down. It's been one small positive to hear more vocally the recognition that local actors, increasingly community actors themselves, are key to ensuring assistance and protection reach those who are most difficult to reach. And this may be a chance to move beyond seeing local actors only as the most cost-effective option, but also to recognizing that they are often the best option to reach communities in need. The second piece we see as an opportunity is the deprofessionalization of coordination, rethinking how systems work so that they don't need to rely on expensive functions being flown in, but actually to ensure that local actors, who are themselves, of course, leading their own organizations at the local level, can use these systems in the right way to support their work. And we think this is a challenge to us to think about what is the minimum workable and viable product for coordination. There's been a lot of great work done with the Core Humanitarian Standard, the Sphere Project and others to try to look at contextualization and local relevance. And perhaps we need to expand this thinking beyond to other parts of the system. And this includes, I think, perhaps to follow through on the devolving of leadership discussions away from Geneva and New York towards the country level and even the subnational level, if possible. And the last point would be to not try to be the answer to every problem. If we have to downsize, we also have to get out of the way. And in some sectors and some contexts, this is going to be forced upon us. And the initial reaction is, of course, that this will mean needs are going to be left unmet. But sometimes this also might create the space for innovative, locally grounded solutions to emerge. And we need to respond in this sense in a more contextual and perhaps modular way that reflects the realities of the situations we're engaging in, not is the one-size-fits-all humanitarian response. So overall, we really recognise that much of the system is now in free fall. It's very hard to take sensible decisions whilst we're in midair, but the decisions are being taken by organisations and often in isolation. And we need to see how we can make these more collective and strategic to bring these together. And part of the value of discussions like today is in helping to sense perhaps where the bottom of that fall might be and how we can soften the landing for the whole system so we bounce back together. So thanks a lot to Impact for convening, and we look forward to the panelist discussion.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Katie, for setting the theme of this discussion. Now, next, I will let the panelists have a first reaction, and then straight after that, open up to the floor. So please consider contributing with your own reflection, with any questions you may have for the panelists or for our speakers. Shall we continue in this order, or does anyone have any preference on who wants to go first? You're okay to go first? Myrène, over to you. Yes.
Thank you, Impact Initiatives, and thank you to all the presenters. We're all kind of blocked at this moment. I'm a representative of a donor, a Swiss humanitarian appeals platform. Many of you might know it by other names than Swiss Solidarity. And I think what we need to pick up from the two panelists' interventions is not only do we need to unwind what has worked before and see how to better use it can be made. But also I would advocate, for instance, on the data issue, that we also want to make things clearer for general audiences. And I speak up here on behalf of our donor base, which is every single Swiss citizen, and to make sure that the humanitarian sector doesn't speak to itself so much. Making a clear case on what is happening in all these different fragile countries and context will be the key to greater commitment and to renewed generosity from other sources, including private sector, including other layers of populations who might not be, to this date, committed to supporting emergency work. That is one thing that strikes me here, that the media attention today is going either to the political backgrounds listed under any of these crises and less to the facts. How can we make these facts stories, real issues that can be relatable for people in all of our contexts? So that's one thing I would take away. And the other, and thank you, Jeremy, for pointing it, is that meaningful participation imposes a reverse of the logic. We're not going to succeed if we speak from our current hyper technician perspective, and of course I put myself in this, I've done this for 25 years as well, making sure that we allow local organizations to come up with their own solutions and that we back them, whatever those solutions look like. And sometimes they will not be as standardized as what we are used to. They will not necessarily be sphere compliant or other levels of compliance, yet we need to address some of the most hard to reach areas with very extreme solutions if we want to go the life-saving route. And that's my initial takeaway.
Thank you very much, Miren. Over to you, Manuel.
With pleasure, thanks, and hello to everybody. Churchill once said, "No, never let a good crisis go to waste." After the shock of this announcement from the USAID in particular, but also other donors, and this is important. Yes, the US cut the most and the most radical one, but we see also cuts here in Europe and significant cuts. After this sort of first shock, I think it's indeed time to sort of wake up and say, okay, what are we doing now? Do we just shrink the whole thing and go on business as usual, more or less, with the big organizations, the UN, the big Red Cross, Red Crescent, and NGOs, just do less with less? Or do we really use this crisis to reshuffle the system? I mean, what we had, still have, but it's crumbling. The humanitarian system, it's huge. Huh? I mean, the money is involved, and you said there's less money available if you break it down per crisis. But when I started, and I risk to reveal my age, back then we called it the humanitarian, what was it? Overview, I had another name. Back then was what is already we sort of were embarrassed to go over 1 billion, and now we are 40-something billion. I mean, there is much, much, much more money involved because also, and this is very true, of course, the needs increased, and this sort of scissor, the needs, and here the money widened more and more, but we have more money available. But now this money looks even less. So do we have to bring the needs down or the responses down, or do we have to really reshuffle and reorganize the system? Jeremy said it. I very much think it's a system-wise challenge that needs a system-wise response. If we do, and it looks to me in the last months, everybody tries to protect his or her little turf or her staff or her contexts. This will not be the appropriate solution or the appropriate response to this major challenge. In this regard, I see, when I look long term, a chance to review the system. Is it really necessary that we need the big five? I mean, these great big UN agencies that have a lot of overlap. They have very much their turf and their mandate, but there is a lot of overlap. Do we have to redesign the humanitarian system as a whole? Of course, this is a very high ambition, and this is not done by tomorrow or next year. But I very much think if we just try now to overcome this current crisis without taking the chances to look particularly far at the far end, we would miss an opportunity. A bit more coming close, because I think we have to look at what we do now and what we do a bit long term. But what we do now, humanitarian action is data driven. Without data, we run blind, and it's not there anymore. Humanitarian action or humanitarian assistance. Then you can call it, I don't know, political, economic, or even worse, military assistance. What's the difference? It's not needs driven, it's not principled. And if we risk to base our activities not anymore on needs and based on the principles, then it's we give up on the humanitarian idea. And therefore, I very much think in the immediate term we have to run perhaps sort of like on a generator when you have a electricity cut, the data system, data gathering, data analysis, and data management, in order to be still principled and need-based, and in the immediate term also capable to respond. Because particularly here in Geneva, you know, everybody's sort of a bit down and then depressed. But I think it's important to say we are not the victims here. I mean, the victims are the people out there in Somalia, in Chad, in you name it, in Lebanon, in Gaza, wherever. And we have an obligation to come out of this in order to serve those best, and not suddenly to change the approach to save the Geneva ecosystem, because yeah, we are only here in order to serve others. This is important to direct a bit the discussion. Long term, immediate term, and who is really the addressee of, or has to be the addressee of our efforts. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Manuel. Over to you, Tamam.
Thank you. Thank you very much. One of the surprising things about this stage is how capable we are of telling ourselves the same stories in different guises. I mean, it reminds me of when you argue with people on the political spectrum, those who will tell you, you know, communism was great, but the Soviets did it wrong. Or capitalism was great, but the Americans did it wrong. Humanitarianism is great, but we've been doing it wrong. If it was great in the first place. And I say that from having spent all my life doing this and having done every mistake I could ever criticize. But, I mean, let's just break down some of this. Data is absolutely important and irreplaceable, and we cannot go blind. Yet data doesn't guarantee equality. Data doesn't make humanitarianism objective. Because when best days we've had data, Somalia still didn't get aid, Sudan didn't get aid, Ukraine got more. Data is not the only driver. The political will is another driver. History is a very good teacher. I mean, the grand bargain was 10 years ago. How much of the power has been shifted to local organizations in the past years? And do we believe that when we were relaxed and no one here from the people who get to sit in high-level meetings was threatened in their jobs, they didn't localize? Why do we believe they would when they are threatened and second, obviously, people who get salaries of Geneva, New York, and Washington, and Paris, and London aren't the victims. They do feel it. And if you go take around in Geneva, you will see the air of despair. I mean, I understand it. It's hard to lose a gig like this. Especially most of us are not employable in the real world. But that doesn't mean that in the days where we weren't thinking of ourselves as the victim, we were serving the victim. I was in Somalia exactly a year ago. Around Baidoa, there are 800,000 people displaced with no water. Their water tanks were empty. I was in Sudan for 2 months this summer. I haven't seen such malnutrition while the UN was arguing whether it is the legal department's advice of not going from Chad was legitimate or not. There were months and months of people, of children, going into severe malnutrition. We weren't doing great, and the Trump cuts are not the problem. Trump cuts are a problem for the superstructure of humanitarianism, for which is fine. I mean, everybody's entitled to believe what they want and defend what matters to them. But having an ahistorical view of humanitarianism, convincing ourselves that everything was okay until, you know, the Tories in the UK or the Trump administration or so on cut the tab, and this is the problem, is ignoring the problem. And I think it leads us to questions like the one of this session, which I think is a legitimate question. But what do we keep is not only what do we keep. What do we keep is what do we drop as well. And we can talk about that all we want. We keep the data and drop the food. We keep the food and drop the schools. This is a narrative that will lead us to figure who is it in my interest to throw under the bus so I can keep my programs, The sad thing is that's not even the narrative. We've published a bit on this in the New Humanitarian. The rapidity by which the system is going to like embarrassing opportunism, from running to their websites to cut DEI to exchanging lists of words that the US administration doesn't like anymore, including, by the way, women. We can't talk about women anymore. To cuts on projects. WFP is cutting rations before they cut jobs in here. And it's difficult to believe that only an objectivity of data is going to cancel all those subjectivities. But to go back to that data, maybe it is time we learn that our objective utopia of being able to compare everything across everything is potentially inhuman itself. Needs are different from places to places. And if we create the perfect decision-making mechanism without decision makers who are willing to be objective about it, and we ignore the fact that politics is what channels money, you can give them all the data that you want, and that isn't going to change much. I don't think Sudan and Somalia and DRC and the Rohingya camps aren't getting enough money because people don't know about them. So yes, absolutely, we need to keep an objective ability to collect data, but if we ignore the fact that this is steeped in politics, that is distorted and getting worse, because not getting worse because the Western governments are getting worse. It's getting worse because they don't care anymore about pretending to be nice. Now weapons get more votes or more something than soft power. If we ignore that, then we are going to keep producing evidence that is not going to lead to real change. I don't know whether I mean, someone said that the optimism and realism, and whether we reshuffle. Maybe reshuffling will work, but if I had a car that was broken, and I had a life or death journey to make on it, I doubt that my response would be to reshuffle the car. I'd probably want to either repair it or replace it, and that might be worth thinking of. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamam. Marisa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Luca. So I want to come in from the perspective of a refugee-led organization. Our seat, both of our directors are former refugees, and we focus on advancing meaningful refugee participation at the global refugee policy level. So here in Geneva, working with UNHCR in particular. And we work as well with obviously all different kinds of actors to make meaningful refugee participation a reality, including states, NGOs, funders, and many others that are part of the systems to ensure that refugee voices can influence policymaking and have a say in the conversations that happen here in Geneva and in New York. So I thought I would say a few of the lessons learned that we've had here in the policy world that perhaps can be applicable when talking about participation in different contexts. And to give you an example, for instance, every 4 years, UNHCR holds the Global Refugee Forum. So in 2019, it was the first one. It's a big meeting on global refugee policy based on the Global Compact on Refugees. In 2019, 72 people were refugee participants, versus in 2023, where over 320 were refugee participants. And this is great, but when we talk about participation, we don't want to focus on quantity. We want to focus on quality, on the meaningful part of refugee participation. The ultimate goal is not to have participation, to do a checklist, to say, well, refugees were here, they had a speaking role, or they were part of, shaping some agenda of some side event, but to actually enhance the responses and the solutions that come out of here in Geneva and the discussions in New York. And for that, I want to highlight 3 principles that I think are very important when we're talking about participation. And the first one is sustainability. So not have ad hoc processes, not thinking of directly impacted communities only in terms of advocacy, or we're only going to bring them to this discussion and cherry pick where they get to participate, but actually have mechanisms that enable that participation. So our seat has worked in co-creating refugee advisory mechanisms at the national level. And so far, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Germany have created refugee advisory mechanisms. And we're working with other countries such as Uganda, Kenya, Colombia, Mexico, Switzerland, Portugal, and others. So ensuring that it's sustainable, that's not an ad hoc process, that's not reserved to observers or just advocacy, and as well as having different voices being part of those mechanisms. So the cohorts are changing every 2 or 3 years, and there's also a diversity, not only in terms of gender, race, religion, and so on, but also a diversity in technical expertise. Who are the refugees that are part of those mechanisms, and what expertise do they bring at the table? And with that, the second principle that I would like to highlight is non-tokenism. So there's a difference between when we talk about consultation and participation. Participation, as I said before, is about enhancing the solutions, the responses that we're working on. And when we want refugees to participate at the table here in terms of policy, we're thinking about not only their lived experience of forced displacement, but also their technical expertise. So what expertise do they bring? Is it in resettlement? Is it on livelihoods? Is it on access to education or mental health services? Because otherwise, if we tap people only because of their lived experience, it results in tokenistic participation. So we don't want to ask, for instance, a woman to participate just because she's a woman, but actually because she can bring the technical expertise that's needed at the table. And the third and last principle that I would like to highlight is for directly impacted people to be actually able to influence decision-making processes. So once we have created the mechanisms sitting at the national level, we ask states to include a refugee advisor in their state delegation to meetings here in Geneva and New York. And this is because we know that states are ultimately the decision makers. It's not NGOs, it's not civil society, it's not even the UN, but it's states. So we ask that states include refugee advisors in their delegations, and that those refugee advisors are able to be part of the decision-making processes that happen here. So ensure that there's influence and that they're able to have a say in what ends up being outcome documents or decisions that are taken here and then taken to the country and local levels. This is the first time that we're seeing refugee experts and governments collaborating as equals, seeing beyond directly impacted people only as beneficiaries of aid and thinking of them as actually partners that can help collaborate and shape solutions. And there is much work to be done, specifically, like I said before, not only in terms of the quantity of people that participate, but actually in the quality of their participation. But we're very glad to see that there are structures and formalized collaboration between refugees and state institutions. And we hope that some of the lessons that we have gathered can help influence other contexts, such as the humanitarian program context, and that this can help better and enhance the programs that are put into the local and country levels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marisa. I suggest we open up straight away to comments, questions from the audience. So online, please write on the chat. I am checking it as well as I can. But should we start here in the room, as there's no questions online? Yes. If you can introduce yourself before taking the floor, please.
Antonio Donini from United Against Inhumanity. I'm nearly as old as, no, older than Manuel in terms of my frequentation of the humanitarian system. And I think we're all struggling with something that has been thrown to us. And we're hesitating between, Ogden Nash said, candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker. And do we want to go for the candy option, rearranging the chairs on the, won't call it the Titanic, but the ISC maybe, or do we want to go for a liquor approach that takes into consideration a structural, historical problem that we are facing? Humanitarian action is a social construct that appeared in the form that we have now at a certain period in time. We can argue whether the historical conditions that allowed humanitarian action as we know it to emerge after the Second World War are still present, or if we have to consider that social contracts, constructs change over time. That's one thing. The other thing is that for my generation and for many, many people who work in the system, have worked in the system, humanitarian action, humanitarian principles was a strong mobilizing myth. It was mobilizing in the sense that it had value, it had gave us the possibility of doing something that had gave us meaning, and I think we've lost that spirit. So we've lost the mobilization, we're left with the myth. And we have created all sorts of myths around humanitarian action that I think we need to unpack. We need to unpack the myth that we are neutral, impartial, and independent, that we can have firewalls between principles and politics. The fact that we're also shocked and surprised that one major donor cuts its funds and then we don't know what to do says a lot about how dependent we were on Western imperialism. I'm exaggerating a bit, but you get the drift. So I think we have to look at history and learn. Obviously, I go for the liquor option rather than the candy option.
Hey, very, very interesting comment. Thank you very much. I see a lot of panelists here scribbling down notes. Well, let's take another couple of comments and then I'll hand over to the panelists to react. Yes, Kim.
Hello, my name's Kim. I'm from the H2H network. Interesting panel and comments, and Antonio too. It seems though we're sort of thinking on slightly different timelines, chronologies. And so to return to the title of the panel, I think it's great that we acknowledge the progress that's been made since the 90s or early 2000s in terms of quality and accountability. And I think everyone agrees that whatever comes out, we don't want to return to a sort of truck and chuck model of aid, which doesn't make any sort of take any heed of who it's being delivered to and how. But if we look at the Grand Bargain, that's nearly 10 years old, and we still have doubts about how much progress has really been made. So if we think that over the next year or two, there will be a process of maybe reform consolidation in the formal system, I'm very glad that we don't have to be part of that. And looking at the state of multilateralism, I don't think we can be too optimistic about what it'll look like, because it is ultimately states who'll push that process along. But if we're talking about keeping the lights on, let's agree that it's not the lights in Geneva, it's the lights at the country level. There are certain things that the humanitarian system has learned how to do around needs assessment, around collective accountability, around security risk management, that we know we need to do good response. And those things aren't going to be existing in 2 years' time if we don't come up with some solutions now. So it would be great to see what those reform processes look like, but we need solutions now, because if we lose those things in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, we'll have to reinvent them. And that's a really inefficient way of doing it. And there'll be a big loss in institutional capacity and institutional memory while we get there.
Okay, great questions. Shall we try and address these two questions, which are linked somehow? I think we can make a thread a link between the two comments that we received. So I like the historical comment question. Have the conditions changed? The conditions which were there to create the humanitarian system change? And should it be, if so, or if not, how much? Should it be liquor or candy? So that's the first question. And then, yes, okay, but then the second one, the grand bargain, has there been progress over the past 10 years at all? But a few things were improving, and should we focus on keeping them, or should we throw out, like, should we just have a liquor straight away and think first of all about the systemic reform we need to have to the humanitarian system, and then rebuild from there rather than trying to keep what's working? Any reflections from the board on these comments from the panel? Sorry, Irene.
Mine will be quite quick. I mean, I think we just have to evaluate that the world has changed in terms of the parameters of attention, which is one of the reasons why we don't get the same commitment from political parties at the moment, that we don't get the same attention even from general audiences, is that we need to rebuild this credibility based on this new paradigm. The paradigm is not, it's the worst situation ever, therefore we need to act. No, the situation has worsened by the nature of conflict, which is man-made in many cases, not the act of nature, and the increase in natural disasters that are also indirectly man-made. So what we need to ensure is that we build a common commitment to pursue a solidarity effort. And this solidarity effort has to be driven by the values of the humanitarian sector, those that were at its core, not the self-preserving values of maintaining a system, which is what always happens with organizations. So debunking some of those constructs is very important. And I really trust that looking at newer generations and how they would approach crisis and fragility is definitely very important in the conversation we're having today.
The question is where to start. On the one hand, you cannot say, sorry, needs, you have to wait now. We have to rethink or to redo, as you, Tamam, said, the humanitarian system. So we come back to you later. But what Kim mentioned, needs are continuously there and actually increasing. So we have to have something as an immediate reaction. We have to safeguard certain services. We have to safeguard a minimum of the response, but at the same time, we have to, I call it reshuffle, in the sense of really looking at the system as it is. I'm the last person who said it's perfect, or it was perfect. By far not, of course not. In all these discussions within the different platforms, and then this turf war and the war about, I don't know, presence on CNN and BBC. Of course, this was often not serving the humanitarian purpose, by far not. But it is, or it was a system that we have, and we try to navigate it around. That's why I mentioned Churchill at the very beginning. With all the difficulties, this is also a chance to indeed look at the system and while continuing doing the daily job, also looking at further in a further distance, and how and we can restructure. Short term, I really see that we could get commitment, and the grand bargain could be also not ideal. I fully agree. By the way, the only instrument that remains from 2016's World Humanitarian Summit. All the rest faded away anyway. But in the grand bargain, we could, because it's a very unique platform where you have donors, where you have the big UN agencies, where you have the Red Cross, Red Crescent, and the NGOs. This is the only sort of table that offers all these actors. If they are committed and if they do their job, that's another question. And I'm not here to defend the grand bargain by far, but it could be sort of a forum where we can get some short-term commitments, more local funding, more flexible funding, more support for CBPFs, country-based pooled funds. It's not, rocket science, and also, by the way, not really new, but some immediate action that could have a rather immediate impact. So on these two levels, I see the approach forward. But I really want to underline, I'm not here to sugarcoat the system how it was, by far not.
Man, yeah.
Thank you, Antonio, for the historical perspective. And by the way, the first time I read the word pluriversal was in one of your articles many years ago, and I owe you a thank you for that. And here, I'm assuming that your question on whether the historical context changed was tongue-in-cheek, because when the whole system was designed, from the UN to the humanitarian system to the Geneva, most of our countries were still colonies. Of course, it changed. And we were under colonial rule. Well, Syria, where I come from, was still a colony of the French. It has changed, and it has changed magnificently. The promise of better life in the future under democracy and liberalism was still not at least as thoroughly debunked and soiled as it is now. And there was still an option, at least a promise and a pretense, that all of us are going to go into a development that leads everybody to an equal future. No one is even pretending that this is the case anymore. And to continue to talk about humanitarianism as if it is in a bubble, apart and away from the rest of the world, is delusional. You want immediate? I don't want to theorize. Let's talk about immediate. PEPFAR stops 2 million people die before Trump finishes his first year in office. I am happy for immediate. Let's go from the highest salary to the lowest and start cutting people until we have enough money to put antiretrovirals in 2 million people. There is immediate that restores the system and keeps it. And there is an immediate, there was a labor philosopher in the 60s from France called André Gors, who talked about reform and non-reformist reform. And what he meant is there's a difference when the subject of your reform is the sustenance of the status quo. And when you reform, as in don't throw the worst expression in history, don't throw the baby with the bathwater, but without the aim of sustaining the organizations at all cost. And I'm afraid in the past 2 months in Geneva, at least, in this now thoroughly depressed town, there hasn't been much talk about what immediate is when mother and child services have stopped, clinics have stopped, HIV patient mother-to-child transmission has resumed. 600 people died in Palestine in the past 10 days. How many times were they mentioned in HNPW? Thank you.
Thank you, Tamam. Marisa, do you want to come in?
Yes, I think in terms of the historical conversation, it reminds me of a conversation I was having recently with a friend that is from an African country, and we're referencing 1945, and I said, those are the times of, the World War, and she said, what World War? It was just Europe in a war. It was just the global North, and then from there, the winners came out and they remained in power. And even myself being a person from the global south of Latin America, I have never thought about it that way. Latin America was not at war. Africa, as you were saying, was trying to decolonize. The majority of Asia was not involved. So it really shifted my perception of how we view wars, because at the moment, so many countries are in conflict, yet we're not calling them world wars. It's only when Europe and the global north are in that position. And that's where we created the systems that rule today. But then in terms of the grand bargain and the commitments that were made there is a participation revolution made in commitment in the grand bargain. And similar to the refugee policy world, the Global Compact for Refugees includes a commitment by states in paragraph 34 that meaningful refugee participation can make solutions more effective. And we have used paragraph 34 to pressure states, UNHCR, and everyone who subscribed to the compact to put it into practice. So if we do have it in paper, if we do have this commitment through the grand bargain, how are we going to make it real? How can we use it? How can we operationalize it? The commitments that have been done in the refugee policy world have been instrumental for us to actually operationalize refugee participation. And the grand bargain hasn't been that helpful, to be honest, in the policy world, but how can it be helpful in the country and local programming world? It's a question that I think we have not taken advantage of what states and donors and others have committed so far.
Okay, thank you very much. I have some one question online, which is more about the solutions we can propose on either assessment. Does anyone have any comments to continue this discussion that we started here before I go into the online question? Yes, please.
Thank you so much, Afana from Plan International. Really appreciate the panel and also all the analogy that's been used. I'm coming from Asia Pacific and all the forgotten crises. I'm not, competing with Gaza, Jordan, etc. because every situation have a unique situation. I'm so just wondering, Tamam, you mentioned about repair, instead of we need to think not even just reset. But just wondering, so what else that we are missing? What kind of stakeholder that we are not able to engage in order for us to helping in this kind of like situation? I know in Asia Pacific, there is a lot of discussion on bringing more and more philanthropics and then corporates, but is it enough? Or is it anything that we are really, really missing? We discussed a lot about how to bring in the local partners. We did it already. Right, the grand bargain, even though it's not like according to what been discussed before, but it's not really ideal for at some point because of there are many factors. Data, political will is totally different. So I'm just wondering from the panel, what we are missing and what should we do in order to kind of like looking into the situation and contributing. And again, the US funding is one trigger. What else if now we saw that we heard that also other government is maybe thinking to cut the funding, right? Not only the US. So what we're missing and what we can do better together. Thank you very much.
Yes, please.
Sorry, I wanted just to build on what you said, if that's okay. I'm Sarah Baldwin. I work for International Health Partners. I'm freelance. I work for International Health Partners and also with the CHS Alliance on communications. And my question I had is really mirroring what you're saying, which is we know who are the losers here, who are the winners, and who do we need to be watching out for? So we work with in International Health Partners. We partner with the corporate sector, so pharmaceutical companies donating, gifting kind, essentially high quality medications, which we then ship to around the world to deliver to NGOs and to based on needs that the communities have already established they have. And I guess my question is, I've worked with various kind of as a freelancer with PwC and looked at ESG and seen kind of people moving into the private sector, moving into DRC and electrifying Goma and taking the electricity out of Goma. So I guess what I'm interested in is what conversations are we having outside of the humanitarian bubble to actually think there will be some big winners here and they're coming for us like now while we're sitting here. So what are we doing to actually speak to the corporate sector, private sector, which is not one homogenous system either, and to make sure that they are part of this conversation if we are going to truly rebuild or reshuffle? Thanks.
Okay, I suggest we take these two questions. How can we repair the system? What are we missing? What can we do together? And then the dimension by both about how can we, who are the winners and how can we work with this private sector? What are the implications of the private sectors coming in and how can we approach ourselves to the private sector, if it's something that we wish at all, actually. Reactions to this?
Well, private sector donorship is what we do, but making sure that it speaks both to citizens, to individuals, to corporates, and to larger institutions drives again on the same value set. Is this has to be put out as an important and mandatory role that the humanitarian sector is playing, and not something that can be scratched, not something that can be wiped out of a task list from any given politician anywhere. There have been very sad stories recently of corporates turning their backs to very key programs, D&I included, but those are just the beginning of reversals on democratic values and inclusion. We have to push back. In fact, I agree with Manuel here that we have to look at the system while responding. So how do we do that? That's number one. How do the still alive donors do that and sustain the lifeline as it is? How do we shift the gears when it comes to creating higher advocacy for those forgotten crises? And just today we were discussing Sudan and how this has to be labeled the crisis of the year. There have been so many other crises and none of them has to be ranked. But we know this one is totally out of the attention span. So how can we play that role, each from their own perspective, the communication perspective being one, but the institutional advocacy and the creating the awareness where it is now and rebuilding this trust has to be one of the key priorities in a world that is driven by marketing and short-term profit.
I think the humanitarian sector has to get rid of this charity sort of appreciation, or being seen as, let's do a bit of good and let's donate, I don't know, the surplus or a part of the surplus or a percentage of the surplus, or, you know, instead of, I don't know, a Christmas card, we give the money. It has this, indeed, this charity flavor. It should, as I tried to mention, become a moral obligation. It's crazy. A lot of organizations, the UN organizations, they live so far because of voluntary contributions. The assessed contribution, meaning the mandatory contributions that come from the member states, are very small. Some of the organizations have none. Why is humanitarian voluntary or donation to humanitarianism? Of course, this is, you know, idle. You could say idle talk, but to be seen as only sort of, yeah, if there is a bit of leftovers, we give something to the humanitarians, and if there is no leftovers, sorry, the first that is cut is the humanitarian aspect. So this appreciation of doing good and with this sort of flavor of, as mentioned, of charity is for sure the wrong approach to get to humanitarianism. On the same at the same time, we have to say there are no humanitarian solutions, particularly not for political problems. I mean, if we only talk in our bubble or in our humanitarian network and then partnership week, it stays here. If we have to burst this bubble and to address problems holistically, I mean, again, it's easily said than done, particularly now when people say, or organizations say, we have to prioritize now. Also, when there are waivers distributed that you get when you do life-saving activities. So all the nexus discussions that we had a couple of years ago are out the window. So we are so adapting to the wind where it's coming from. if the idea of solidarity is more anchored, or would be more anchored, and more present, and more sort of like a red thread in our policies, I think this would give the whole discussion a very different spin.
Thank you. I completely agree that we should consider humanitarian aid a moral obligation. It actually has a name. It's called reparations. And it's not an option I mean, if that is the consideration, then it wouldn't be an option anymore. But I doubt that we're going to see that anytime soon. Especially, I mean, let alone reparations for previous catastrophes that the West imposed on the rest of the world. The extraction continues. I mean, we've had a Paris Agreement, and I mean, it didn't even slow the emissions from, at least not in a way that would change. I just want to address the point about what do we do. I mean, I honestly don't know that any one person would be legitimate in saying what do we do, but my inclination is devolve power entirely, and I mean entirely. Local partners, as they have been, is a very good step. I mean, absolutely, give power to local partners. Not 20% of the money with 80 or 70% going to the overseers, but let's be honest, the local partners, as they qualify, are largely handing over the power from international bourgeoisie to local bourgeoisie. They are the ones who speak English, who have the luxury of being able to function as charities in there. Those aren't the grassroots, they aren't the beneficiaries. We're handing over from one elite to the other. And if we're talking, I mean, and we've done something very proficient in the past couple of decades, which is hyper-professionalizing humanitarianism against evidence. Now you have advisors on everything, whether it is scientifically valid or not, because then you can't really devolve power anymore. You need the experts, as dubious the expertise as it might be. I think there are a couple of things. One of them is data is absolutely important, and data cannot be objective. I think we need to be able to accept and absorb subjectivities and intersubjectivities from places we come from. I don't know that we realize how judgmental we are about stuff. I mean, even the most purely intended, when we talk about women in countries affected by crises, we don't talk about them in the same way we talk about women in the West, for example. When we talk about people, we don't grant them agency by default and say it's being taken from them. We talk about, so there are narratives, there are stories. We are a species that is based on being able to empathize through storytellings, not pie charts and graphs only, or primarily even. We need to accept subjectivities. We need to embrace them. We don't filter stories just to get the ones that will resonate with the Western audience. We need to accept it altogether. The other thing is on, I mean, I hope I'm wrong. I am dubious about private sector. I mean, pharmaceutical companies. Did we really forget the pandemic? It's not that far in the past when they refused absolutely to allow manufacture of vaccines and other medicines for cheap in other countries, and were supported by governments. My problem is not that they are taking the DNI from their websites. They're fine. My problem is that they are selling weaponized AI to the IDF to identify and bomb people. Google has taken out any commitment to not use AI as a weapon. Those are the problem, and we're demanded to have like the ability to a split personality that accepts their benevolence and their actions at the same time. if anything, and I realize we need the money, of course, we need to give people something. But the answer is not to accept it unconditionally. The answer is to put conditions on what we used to do that. The humanitarian sector used to not accept money from tobacco, pharmaceuticals, and weapon manufacturers. And I think we're not far from tech companies becoming weapons manufacturers at this rate. So maybe asking them to justify themselves rather than going with a hat in hand might be a good idea. Don't know.
Thank you, Tamam. Marisa, you want to react also?
Well, I don't necessarily have the answers of what we can do, but I do have ideas of things that we need to stop doing. And one of them is continue to live in this bubble of meeting in the global north, and which is a very exclusive and elite spaces, and leaving people who are directly impacted behind. They face structural, financial, political barriers. Even getting a visa to get to New York or Switzerland, it's impossible. Or nearly impossible for so many people. And as you go through this week, think about it. How many people have you met that's part of this conference that's directly impacted or is leading an organization, or part of an organization led by someone that's directly impacted? Isn't it ironic that we're meeting in Geneva talking about localization and fancy hotels with receptions that probably cost a 1 year, access to nutrition for someone in the global south? So I think dismantling the systems and the spaces, giving voices to people who are impacted by the problems and having them sit here at these tables. The UN remains a very colonial space. It remains a very closed-gated space. So how can we change that? I think a lot of what happens here in Geneva and in New York is often seen. It's often elite conversations, right? But how can we make those conversations real? How can we have people that are facing the realities part of those conversations? Would that solve the problem, putting people directly impacted within the system? No, but I think it perhaps will bring some ideas and solutions that we haven't thought of before. And then in terms of private sector, I am also dubious of the connection between capitalism and the humanitarian system. And I think I'm not going to add to it until there is particular research that can show how can they collaborate, if they can collaborate at all.
Thank you so much for your reactions. There's one question online which I will take. It's a little bit detailed. The question is, what are your concrete ideas to make the humanitarian data ecosystem more efficient and coherent in order to maintain or improve needs analysis? We all agree that need analysis is important, but the status quo is unaffordable in the current environment. So it's an anonymous person who asked the question. Does anyone want to make a very quick reaction to this? Maybe Katie, you want to come in?
I'm still trying to think of a reply on whether needs are comparable, but anyway. So on this, yeah, I think we've been thinking about this quite a lot internally. I think we cannot survive without speaking to populations affected by crises. We will not understand what populations are experiencing. We will not understand what they need, what their preferences, what their priorities are. And I personally can't really see a quick way beyond some, maybe some technological fixes like online data collection, etc., to get around that fundamental necessity to talk to people affected by crisis. And that does cost money because it requires people to go out, speak to those populations, understand what's going on, and explain their stories. But I think we can try and make that more targeted. We can try and make sure that the data collection that occurs speaks to itself better, so that when we do an assessment in one area, it's comparable to an assessment in another area or in another location over time. So I think there are efficiencies in the way we design our data collection systems, and I think we can become more targeted and more efficient. And I think on analysis, I think there we can make much greater strides from an efficiency perspective, using things like AI. But again, we have to be really careful here, because that becomes another black box, which again makes it very, very difficult for populations to participate. So I think we can look at technologies probably more in the analysis space to speed things up and make them more efficient. But I think we have to be really thoughtful about doing that in a way that enables analysis to remain participatory and accountable.
Thank you, Katie. All right, we're coming to the end of the panel, I believe, right? 5:30, indeed. So let me conclude by thanking all of you. I found this really quite an enriching discussion for myself, lots of food for thought, and I hope for all of you. And I like the fact we went back to actually with the real question, were we doing the right thing before, right? And you broke it down into two things. Were we doing the right, did we have the right values and did we have the right action? It's two questions we should ask ourselves. Are values a result of historical events, of a specific moment of time, or are they a self-fulfilling narrative that we start believing in ourselves, in our own bubble? Where are these values coming from? Is it something that it's worth fighting for when we say humanitarian values as values of humanity, or do they only define ourselves as this sector, as people belonging to this sector to defend ourselves? And are they really global or not? So that's an interesting question. And then based on this, the option that we have is, do we renew our values? First, we have to define and then update them probably, maybe, I don't know how, but do we renew our values and reinforce them? And then we adapt our action, picking what's working, adjusting to the new realities around them, and rooting all this in a sort of common humanity that we update and that can speak to everyone, be it you're here in Switzerland, Miran, as you were said, or people affected by crisis. This is one thing that we do. Or do we start completely afresh? In which case we need to rebuild our values, because that is, are they delusional? Because the values that we self-fulfilling kind of values ourselves. Are they an historical representative of historical misnarrative? In which case, yes, we should speak about reparation. If that's what we should talk about. Let's speak about it. If humanitarianism is a substitute for reparation, let's speak about reparation. Let's not call it humanitarianism. I think that's a very valid argument to be had, but let's call it what it is. And maybe it's two separate things, actually. And or do we need a new political narrative? I love the fact that we went back to some interesting political narrative in this era of postmodernism, but maybe that's the new Hegelian swing that we need to have, right? Let's go back to collective narrative. Can we have a global collective narrative now in the current times? Possibly. Now, easier said than done. I mean, and that's why it's been an interesting discussion, because we now that there's a lot of interesting questions. But then, how do we do this? Who does it? With whom do we do it? Private sector? I don't know. I don't know if any of us know. But especially, who are we and what do we represent? I mean, these are the foundational questions that we need to ask ourselves, subsequent to the other question I mentioned earlier. And then, once we answer these questions, how do we tread a narrative? Because I think we do need a global narrative as humanity these days. Anyway, I leave it like this. Thank you so much. It's been really, really great to have you. Thank you for accepting. Thank you for being there and contributing. And let's continue.